The winter of 1894 came early to St. Clair, settling over the village like a damp shroud. Snow clung to the narrow stone streets, muting the sound of cartwheels and church bells, while the hills beyond seemed swallowed in a perpetual fog. On the tallest rise stood the orphanage, a squat gray structure of weathered limestone, its roof steep and black with age. It looked almost older than the earth it stood on, a building that did not belong to any one time. The villagers called it Saint Michel's home, though few had ever stepped beyond its iron gates. They saw it from below, a silhouette in the mist, and thought of warm soup and a gentle hand for the forsaken children who lived there. At its heart was Sister Genevieve, a woman whose reputation for kindness was as solid as the stone walls she ruled over. She moved through the village markets twice a week, wrapped in a wool shawl that smelled faintly of lavender soap, her eyes the color of worn steel. She spoke softly, never hurried, never raised her voice. To the villagers, she was the image of patience, the kind of woman who could cradle a crying child until the sobs melted into sleep. Her presence was a comfort, especially in a place where winters could take the old and the young without warning. Yet the comfort she offered was never warm, not truly. It was the stillness of a frozen pond, beautiful and deceptive, hiding something unmoving in its depths. The children of Saint Michel were rarely seen. Now and then one might be spotted walking in the yard behind the orphanage, a small figure in a wool cap trudging in silence through the snow. They never waved. They never called out to passers-by. They seemed bound by some quiet agreement not to break the wall between them and the village. The few who had entered the orphanage, deliverymen bringing flour, the parish priest on feast days, all spoke of how immaculate it was inside. The floors shone like wet marble. The air smelled of boiled linens and faintly of vinegar. No dust on the window sills, no toys scattered in corners, no loose paper. The building seemed to reject disorder with the same precision as a watchmaker's bench. Sister Genevieve's quarters, they said, were lined with wooden shelves stacked neatly with glass jars, each sealed with wax and labeled in tiny handwriting. They assumed they contained herbs, perhaps for teas or medicinal balms, the kind every good nun might prepare for her charges. No one thought to question why she never gave these remedies to the children. St. Clair was the kind of place where questions were as rare as visitors. Life followed the rhythm of the church bells and the turning seasons, and the orphanage was simply part of that landscape, a fixture like the old windmill or the stone bridge over the river. The only oddity anyone remarked on was how quiet the building remained, even with more than 24 children inside. There were no shouts, no quarrels, no bursts of song. Only once, late one night, a shepherd returning from the far field swore he heard crying from the hill, a thin wail carried on the wind. He told no one for years, and when he did, they laughed it off as the sound of foxes. Behind the orphanage gates, Sister Genevieve kept a ledger. It was not the official book she showed the parish, where the children's names and birth dates were recorded in proper ink. This one was smaller, bound in faded cloth and hidden in a drawer beneath her bed. In it, each child was marked not by name but by a curl of hair glued to the page. The hair varied in shade and texture, pale blonde wisps, thick black spirals, soft brown waves, each snipped clean near the root. Beneath every curl was a date. It was not the date they arrived, nor the date they might be adopted. It was a date only she understood, one that would come again, sometimes in weeks, sometimes in years. She would touch the curls with her fingertips when she could not sleep, the way others might finger a rosary, her lips moving soundlessly as she went from one to the next. No one in St. Clair imagined that behind Sister Genevieve's calm gaze was a mind that did not see children as people in the same way they did. To her, they were raw material, vessels carrying something fragile, invisible, and imperfect. Her task, as she saw it, was not to care for them, but to correct them. This was her vocation, the work God had given her, to strip away the flaws that life and birth had left in them. The villagers thought she saved lives. She believed she saved souls. The first snow of that winter fell heavy, covering the orphanage roof in white and sealing the gates in a crust of ice. Down in the village, smoke rose from chimneys, and people spoke of the cold in the easy way of those who had seen many winters. They did not see the small footprints that led from the orphanage's rear door to the woods, or the faint drag marks alongside them. They did not hear the muffled sound of the back door closing just before dawn. St. Clair had learned not to look too closely at the hill, and the hill, in turn, kept its secrets. To the villagers of St. Clair, Sister Genevieve was known first by her scent. It was not the cloying sweetness of perfume, but the clean, faintly medicinal fragrance of lye soap, the kind used to scrub hospital floors and launder altar cloths. It followed her wherever she went, clinging to her clothes and skin as if she had been carved from it. People said you could tell she was near even before you saw her. A hint of lavender under the sharpness, the smell of boiled linens on a frost-bitten morning. Mothers trusted her because of that smell. It spoke of hygiene, of order, of a woman who would keep their children safe. But behind the locked doors of the orphanage, it was the scent of erasure. It smothered every trace of blood, bile, or anything else that might hint at what had been done. She kept the children spotless. Their nails were clipped, their hair cropped close, their clothes scrubbed until the fabric thinned and the seams frayed. Each morning they were lined up in the washroom, stripped and inspected in silence. Sister Genevieve moved among them with a white enamel basin in her hands, dipping a cloth into steaming water before wiping their faces, their necks, behind their ears. She never spoke during these inspections, but her eyes missed nothing. A cough too deep, a bruise that did not fade, a child who winced at the wrong touch. All were noted and filed away in her mind. She claimed this ritual was to keep sickness from spreading, but the truth was darker. She was cataloging the small imperfections that marked a child as unworthy of keeping. In the locked cupboard of her quarters, beyond the jars that visitors assumed held dried herbs, were others filled with hair. Not bundles, not random clippings, but perfect curls sealed in layers of paraffin. They were arranged by shade, from the palest flax to the deepest black, each tied with a narrow strip of white muslin. Some jars held a single curl, others a dozen. The older ones were fogged with time, their contents brittle. But each was labeled in Sister Genevieve's small, tidy hand. The labels bore no names, only dates, the same dates that appeared in her hidden ledger. The jars were her calendar, each marking the day she had first prepared a child. No one else knew what preparation meant in her mind. It was not the act of feeding or clothing them, though she did both with mechanical precision. It was a process of cleansing, not of the body but of the soul as she understood it. She believed sin could not be washed from the flesh by prayer alone. It had to be coaxed out little by little, through the most intimate removal of what she considered the soul's anchor, the hair. She had convinced herself that each lock she took carried away a portion of the child's earthly corruption. The younger they were, the purer the strand. When new arrivals came to the orphanage, infants left at the gate in woven baskets. Toddlers brought by parish priests after a mother's death. Sister Genevieve always greeted them alone. She would take them into the laundry where the air was thick with steam and bathe them herself. She told herself this was necessary for their health, but it also allowed her to examine them to determine what was wrong in them. Her hands were gentle, but her eyes were cold, searching for signs of moral weakness in the set of their jaws, the shape of their eyes, the way they cried. She would take her first lock of hair during that bath, slipping it into her apron pocket before drying them and dressing them in the orphanage's plain garments. That curl went straight into a jar. The process had begun. To the villagers, she was simply thorough. They admired the way her children never looked dirty or ragged, unlike the ones in other towns. They assumed her strict hygiene was an act of mercy. Even the parish priest praised her for it in his sermons, saying that cleanliness of the body was the first step toward cleanliness of the soul. None of them thought to ask why the children's hair never seemed to grow beyond a certain length, or why she insisted on shaving the heads of those who fell ill. They told themselves it was to stop lice, to prevent contagion. That explanation was easier to live with than the truth, that she could not bear to let a single hair grow past the date she had chosen. The children learned quickly not to resist her washroom rituals. The few who did were punished, though never in ways the village could see. She did not strike them. Instead, she would keep them awake for nights at a time, making them kneel on bare stone, their heads wet and cold until they shivered uncontrollably. She would whisper to them during these punishments, telling them they had to let her work finish, that it was the only way to make them whole. By morning, their will was gone. Over time, the smell of soap became more than a scent. It was a signal, a warning. In the dormitories, children would stiffen at the faintest trace of it in the air, knowing it meant she was coming. It seeped into their blankets, their pillows, into their very skin until they could not remember a time when they had smelled anything else. It was the smell of their world, and in Sister Genevieve's mind, the smell of progress, the invisible proof that her mission was working. The frost that year seemed to seep into bone before the season had properly begun. By late November, St. Clair's fields lay under a frozen crust, and the river ran slowly beneath a skin of ice. Inside the orphanage, the air was warm enough from the coal stoves, but the warmth did not reach the children's faces. They moved slower, spoke less, and coughed in short, shallow bursts as if trying not to wake something. Meals were thinner. Watery soups, bread so dense it seemed to weigh them down. But Sister Genevieve never admitted the stores were low. She walked the halls with her ledger tucked under her arm, her fingers occasionally brushing the curl of hair pressed between its pages, as though each lock reminded her of work yet to be done. It was during that first hard month that the children's names began to disappear. At first, it seemed like an oversight. Emily and the small boy with restless eyes noticed that during roll call, Sister Genevieve had begun referring to some by their bed number instead of their name. 4, she would say, and a pale girl with cropped hair would shuffle forward. 7, and a boy with a permanent cough would obey. There was no explanation, no correction, just the steady replacement of identity with numbers. Within weeks, half the dormitory was known only by these designations. The other half whispered their names to each other at night as though trying to keep them alive. But even in whispers, the names felt weaker. One bitter morning, a man from the next village arrived to deliver firewood. He was the only outsider to enter the main hall that week. While stacking the logs near the stove, he noticed a row of children seated along the far wall. Their heads shaved smooth, each wrapped in the same gray blanket. Their eyes did not follow him, and their chapped lips did not part to speak. He tried to ask one her name, but Sister Genevieve's voice cut across the room, calm and sharp. "They are not to be disturbed." She guided him back to the door with polite firmness. He left with the uneasy feeling that he had seen something meant to be hidden, though he could not have said why. The true reason was simple to her. In her mind, a name was an anchor to the earthly self, a tether to imperfection. By removing it, she was freeing the child's spirit from the weight of who they had been. In her notes, she marked each renunciation date alongside the curl of hair she had taken. From that moment, they were hers in a way they had not been before. A nameless child was pliable, easier to shape, easier to prepare for what came next. The weather worsened in December, the sky a constant lid of low gray clouds. The children were kept indoors, and the air in the dormitories grew thick, sour with the smell of unwashed blankets. Sickness spread quietly, beginning with fevers that lasted only a day before fading into weakness. Sister Genevieve inspected each patient, pressing her cool palm to their forehead, her lips moving as though in prayer. Those who did not improve within 3 days were moved to the infirmary, a small room near the laundry where the windows were kept shut tight. The children whispered that no one returned from the infirmary, though in truth 1 or 2 did. Pale, silent, and different, their hair shorter, their eyes less focused. One night in the heart of the freeze, a visiting doctor came from Saint-Denis, sent by the diocese to check on the children's health. His breath fogged in the main hall as Sister Genevieve greeted him with her usual softness, offering tea before the inspection. He moved briskly through the dormitories, making notes until he reached a child in bed 7. Lifting the boy's head, he saw 2 small puncture marks just behind the ear. Not scratches, not bites, but clean, deliberate incisions, each the width of a knitting needle. They were healing evenly as though they tended to. The doctor asked how they'd happened, but Sister Genevieve's answer was fluid, practiced. "An accident with a comb," she said. "A foolish attempt by the child to cut his own hair." The doctor frowned but said nothing. By the next morning, his horse was gone from the stable, and the sleigh that had brought him lay abandoned at the foot of the hill. Sister Genevieve told the children he had been called to another parish, but some swore they had heard the crunch of boots in the snow well past midnight, and a second set of steps behind them. In the ledger beside the date of his visit, she pasted not a child's curl but a small strand of coarse brown hair, shorter and grayer than the rest. From then on, the infirmary door was locked day and night. The remaining children learned to avoid looking toward it, as though the act might draw its attention. Meals continued, lessons were held, prayers were said at the same hours. The rhythm of life unchanged on the surface. But underneath, something had shifted. Even the younger ones could feel it. It was the first winter in which the names began to vanish, and with them the memory of who they had been. It was the first winter when the only proof a child had ever lived might one day fit inside a jar. The first of the packages appeared after the New Year thaw. A small bundle wrapped in brown paper and tied with thin twine, left on the stone step of a cottage near the church. Inside was a curl of golden hair, bound with a strip of white ribbon. The family who found it had buried their infant daughter only a week before, taken by a fever that moved too quickly for the priest to arrive in time. At first they thought it a cruel prank, some village child's attempt at mischief, but the ribbon was so neat, the paper so clean, that they could not believe it was the work of another child. They left it on the mantel, unsure whether to throw it away or keep it as a relic. In the weeks that followed, more parcels appeared, always the same. Brown paper twine, a single curl tied with white ribbon, delivered in silence to doorsteps in the night. Every recipient was a family that had lost a child within the month. In a place like St. Clair, such losses were not rare, but the coincidence began to gnaw at the villagers. No one ever saw the deliveries being made. They would wake to find the bundle waiting. The snow on the path before their door undisturbed except for a single clean footprint that led away and vanished into the road. The first to connect the parcels to the orphanage was a widow named Maëlle, who had once worked in the laundry there. She noticed the ribbon was the same kind Sister Geneviève used to tie the children's hair after washings. Narrow, sturdy, and frayed slightly at the edges from repeated boiling. When she mentioned it quietly in the market, some nodded grimly, others shushed her. It was not wise to speak against a woman of the church. Besides, who could say what harm there was in returning a lock of hair to grieving parents? But Sister Geneviève was not returning anything. In her mind, the hair did not belong to the families. It belonged to her work. Each curl sent into the village was part of a ritual that had taken shape over years of careful practice. When a child died, she believed their soul hovered, heavy with the residue of earthly life, unable to rise fully into purity. To send it upward, she would cut the hair close to the scalp, wash it in scalding water infused with herbs, and tie it with the white ribbon. The curl was then pressed into the hands of the deceased in the coffin, or if burial had already taken place, delivered to the family so it could rest in the home until the spirit lightened. Of course, no one outside her locked quarters saw the rest of the process. The jars that did not leave the orphanage were stored in a row along the wall near her copper contraption, their contents arranged by the date of death. She would take each jar in turn, heat it over a small flame until condensation formed inside, and then scrape the vapor into a vial. This, she believed, was the concentrated essence of innocence. It had no scent, no color, only weight in her mind. A few drops would be mixed into the milk of the living children, passing along the purity as she described it in her hidden notes. The village priest, Father Alaric, received a bundle one morning after losing his own nephew to pneumonia. He did not question where it came from, only assumed it was a token of sympathy. But later, during a visit to the orphanage, he noticed a child in the corridor with a head shaved so close that the skin was raw. The boy's eyes were fixed on the floor and his lips moved soundlessly as if reciting something. Father Alaric felt a chill but said nothing. The hair bundles had by then become something unspoken, a quiet tradition that everyone accepted without admitting it existed. One night Emilian, still small enough to be ignored when he kept to the shadows, saw Sister Genevieve preparing one of the parcels. The hair was damp from washing, steam rising faintly as she tied the ribbon. Her movements were exact, almost reverent, as though she were handling relics of a saint. When she was finished, she placed the curl in its paper wrapping, tied the twine in a perfect square knot, and set it by the back door. He watched her slip out into the snow without a lantern, the bundle in her hands, her steps silent. She returned 15 minutes later, empty-handed. The next morning, Emilian overheard two villagers speaking in the market about a package left for the family of a drowned boy. They wondered aloud how the hair could be so dry and clean if the child had been pulled from the river. Neither questioned it further. Death was a subject they preferred to keep behind closed doors, just as they did with the hill and its orphanage. By the end of that winter, the parcels were no longer met with confusion. They were placed on mantels, tucked into drawers, sometimes even sewn into the lining of a coat, as though carrying them might offer some protection against further loss. Sister Genevieve's reputation only grew. She was seen as a woman who understood grief, who honored the dead in a way others could not. No one guessed that each ribbon and curl was not an act of comfort, but another step in a long, unseen ritual. For her, every death was not an ending, but a harvest. The copper contraption sat in the farthest room of the orphanage, a place the children called the Red Wing because of the strange warmth that seeped from beneath its door. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like an oversized still, its polished surfaces gleaming even in the dim light, its pipes coiling upward like the roots of a metallic tree. Sister Genevieve had acquired it years earlier, ordered from a catalog under the pretense of needing an industrial water purifier for the orphanage. No one questioned it. In a place where disease could sweep through a dormitory in days, clean water was a noble pursuit. But the machine did not purify water. It distilled something she believed to be infinitely rarer. The process began with hair, always hair taken from the living and the dead alike. Each curl was cleaned in near boiling water, then dried in a muslin cloth until no moisture remained. She would then place it into the copper chamber, seal the lid and light the small gas flame beneath. Slowly the strands would darken, releasing a faint scent like scorched sugar mixed with something faintly metallic. A thin vapor would rise, winding its way through a narrow tube that coiled upward before descending into a glass flask. The first drops would be cloudy, but soon they cleared, forming a colorless liquid that clung to the sides of the glass like oil. To Sister Genevieve, this was the essence, the soul's residue freed from its earthly anchor. She believed the essence carried purity in its most concentrated form. A drop on the tongue of a healthy child, she was certain, could correct flaws invisible to the human eye, selfishness, disobedience, envy. In her mind, these were not traits learned but impurities in the spirit, blemishes that could be washed away if one had the courage to do it. The village saw her as a caretaker. She saw herself as a craftsman, refining raw material until it matched her vision of perfection. The red wing was kept locked at all times, its key hanging from a chain around her neck. Children were forbidden to even stand near the door, though some whispered about what they heard inside. On nights when the wind was still, a faint humming filled the corridor, followed by an occasional hiss and the sound of liquid dripping into glass. The heat would seep into the stone floor, warming the air in ways that felt unnatural in the dead of winter. A few claimed to have seen her leaving the room with vials tucked into the folds of her habit, their contents shimmering when caught by light. Sister Genevieve recorded every distillation in her private ledger. Each entry noted the date, the source of the hair, and the yield, a measure not in volume but in perceived purity. She claimed in her writings that hair from the very young was the most potent, especially from those who had not yet spoken their first words. Death, she believed, did not diminish the quality. In some cases it enhanced it, as if the final release of breath freed the last of the soul's weight. She did not feed the essence to all the children, only those she deemed salvageable. A drop would be slipped into their morning milk, and she would watch them closely in the days that followed. Some grew quieter, their eyes unfocused as if listening to something distant. Others became unnervingly compliant, moving through their tasks with mechanical precision. A few resisted, their behavior worsening, and these she considered lost causes. The failed subjects often ended up in the infirmary where their hair would eventually find its way into the copper chamber. Her obsession with precision extended beyond the machine. She kept samples of each batch in tiny corked vials, stored in a locked drawer along with a set of brass calipers for measuring the diameter of hair strands. She believed thickness indicated resilience while fineness suggested fragility of spirit. In the margins of her notes, she speculated about the effect of mixing hair from multiple sources. Could one child's purity temper another's flaws, or would the impurities spread like infection? These were experiments she carried out quietly, never repeating a method more than once unless the results pleased her. The villagers never saw the red wing, but they sometimes noticed changes in the orphanage children. A boy known for screaming in the night would suddenly sleep soundly, his face slack and pale. A girl who refused to eat would begin to finish every meal with blank-eyed obedience. To outsiders, it looked like discipline and care. To Sister Genevieve, it was proof that her method worked, that her science of purity was succeeding where ordinary prayer failed. One evening, Emilian crept close enough to peer through the red wing's keyhole. What he saw was not the machine, but Sister Genevieve herself, seated at a small table beside it, holding a vial up to the light. She tilted it slowly, watching the liquid slide along the glass as though reading something in its movement. On the table lay a small braid of hair, still tied at one end with white ribbon, and beside it a child's cloth doll, its head scorched and unraveling. He did not know what the doll meant, but he knew the hair belonged to a girl who had not been seen in days. In the ledger, that girl's entry was marked with a rare note in red ink. Yield, exceptional. essence clear as glass. Emilian had learned, like the others, that the best way to survive was to be still, to blend into the background until Sister Genevieve's eyes passed over him as though he were just another piece of furniture. But something inside him refused to surrender completely. At night, when the other children lay in rigid silence, he would lie awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the drip of water somewhere deep in the building. It came in a slow, deliberate rhythm, not like the leaking roof in the laundry, but steadier, purposeful, as if counted. The sound followed him into his dreams when he did, managed to sleep, turning into a steady pulse that grew louder until it drowned out everything else. One night the sound seemed closer than ever. It was winter still, the windows sealed tight against the cold, the air heavy and sour with breath. Emilian lay in his narrow bed counting the drops. 4 between each breath, always 4. He began to realize that every time the dripping stopped, somewhere in the building a door would open or close and soft footsteps would follow. Once the steps passed so near his dormitory door that he could see the faint shadow moving in the hall, long and narrow, gliding past without hesitation. The other children said nothing in the mornings. Their faces were pale, their eyes ringed with dark smudges. A few had begun to flinch at any sudden sound, as if waiting for something they could not name. Emilian noticed that certain beds were empty now, the blankets folded neatly as though waiting for someone who would never return. The numbers Sister Genevieve called during roll were fewer, though she did not seem troubled by it. She moved with the same calm precision, her hands smelling of soap and her eyes always calculating. Emilian's own hair had been cut shorter than most, cropped so close that the skin showed through in pale patches. His scalp itched constantly, but scratching it brought a sharp reprimand. He tried to ignore it, but at night he would feel the cold air touch the bare spots and imagine tiny holes beneath the stubble like the punctures he had seen on bed 7. He knew better than to ask about them. The dreams began in earnest after the 2nd week without sleep. In them he saw the copper machine in the red wing, its pipes gleaming, steam curling upward like ghostly fingers. The dripping sound was louder there, echoing against the walls until it seemed to seep into his bones. In the dreams he would see Sister Genevieve's hands holding a small glass vial, tilting it toward his mouth, and the liquid inside would glisten with the same shine as the ice on the orphanage roof. He would wake with his throat dry and the taste of metal in his mouth. One night, unable to bear the sound any longer, Emilian slipped from his bed and crept into the hall. The stones were cold beneath his bare feet, but he moved silently, keeping to the shadows. The dripping was louder here, guiding him like a rope through the dark. It led him past the laundry, where the air was warm and smelled faintly of singed fabric, to the door of the Red Wing. The light beneath it was dim but steady. He pressed his ear to the wood and heard the faint hiss of the copper machine, followed by the slow clink of glass being set down. Then came another sound. A soft voice speaking words he did not recognize, low and rhythmic like a prayer but heavier, as though weighed down by something far older than the church. He leaned closer, straining to hear, and caught the edge of a whisper. "The fear resists." The words made his chest tighten. He didn't know if they were meant for him or for someone else, but he stepped back all the same, his heart pounding. The floor seemed to tilt beneath him as he hurried back to bed, the dripping following him like a shadow he could not shake. The next morning, Sister Genevieve's eyes lingered on him during roll call. She said nothing, but her gaze was sharper than usual, as if testing the weight of him. That night the dripping did not come. Instead, there was silence so complete it rang in his ears. He thought he might sleep at last, but the absence of sound was worse, a hollow space waiting to be filled. When the footsteps came hours later, they stopped outside his door. He shut his eyes and forced his breathing into an even rhythm, pretending to sleep. The door opened. He felt the cold air spill into the room, carrying with it the faint smell of soap and the sharper scent of boiled herbs. The footsteps moved to his bed and a shadow fell across his face. He kept still, his heart pounding against his ribs. Fingers brushed his scalp, tracing the line of his hair, then paused as if listening for something within him. The hand withdrew, and after a moment the footsteps retreated. The door closed. He did not move until morning, but when he reached up to touch his head, he felt a patch of hair missing, cut so close it was almost smooth. On his pillow lay a single strand, pale and curling at the end, as though it had been pulled rather than cut. In her ledger under his number, Sister Genevieve wrote only, "Essence fails. Fear persists." The winter sun was thin when Father Lucien arrived, his sleigh drawn by a pair of chestnut horses whose breath steamed in the frigid air. The village had not seen him before. He was newly appointed to a parish in the next valley and had come at the bishop's request to offer Mass for the orphanage. His cassock was neat but worn, his face pale from travel and his voice soft with the unhurried cadence of one who expected to be listened to. The villagers greeted him warmly enough, though their welcome cooled when he asked too many questions about the hill. They told him Sister Genevieve was a blessing, a woman who had given her life to God's work. Still, he noticed they never met his eyes when they said it. The orphanage looked different up close. The gray stone was darker than he'd expected, as if the cold had soaked into it, and the windows reflected the light in a way that made it hard to see inside. Sister Genevieve met him at the door, her hands clasped neatly in front of her, the scent of soap drifting from her habit. She thanked him for coming, her voice as calm as the snow-laden sky, and led him through the main hall. Everything was orderly to the point of sterility. Rows of identical coats on pegs, boots arranged with military precision, the air scrubbed of any scent but soap and faint vinegar. The children sat in silence at long tables, their heads bent, hands folded. Not one looked up as he passed. During Mass, Father Lucien noticed that the children's responses were whispered, as if rehearsed rather than spoken from the heart. Their eyes were fixed somewhere beyond him, on a point above the altar. When he gave the homily, speaking of mercy and the grace that comes from suffering, Sister Genevieve's gaze did not waver. But when he spoke of the sanctity of the body as God's creation, her jaw tightened, and she glanced briefly toward the door at the far end of the hall, a door he would later learn led to the Red Wing. After the service, she offered him tea in her quarters. The room was small but unnervingly clean, every surface polished, every object placed with mathematical care. Along one wall stood the shelves of sealed jars he had heard about from the villagers. At first he assumed they held preserves, fruit, perhaps, or herbs, but something in their uniform size and the faintly visible shapes inside unsettled him. He stepped closer, and in the pale light saw the unmistakable curl of hair in one jar, tied with ribbon. In another, a darker coil, glistening faintly as though oiled. He asked lightly what they were. Sister Genevieve's answer was immediate and smooth. Keepsakes for the children, mementos she prepared for them to carry into adulthood. Father Lucien smiled politely, but the answer lodged in his mind like a thorn. That night he stayed in a small guest room at the orphanage, the smell of soap seeming to seep from the walls. He lay awake listening, and sometime after midnight he heard the faint hiss of the copper machine. Then came the sound of slow footsteps passing his door and the same muffled dripping Emilian had long ago learned to fear. He rose quietly, following at a distance until the footsteps disappeared through the door to the Red Wing. In the morning, he asked to see the entire building, claiming he wished to bless every room. Sister Genevieve agreed without hesitation, moving briskly ahead of him. She showed him the dormitories, the kitchen, and the laundry. But when they came to the Red Wing, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the key at her neck. She explained that the room was used for storage and not suitable for visitors. Her voice was kind but final. He did not press, but he noticed how her eyes measured him, as though weighing whether he was curious or dangerous. He stayed for 2 more days, and on each one he tried to speak privately with the children. Most would not meet his gaze. One boy, Emilian, held his eyes for a moment before shaking his head almost imperceptibly. A warning Father Lucien could not ignore. That night he prayed longer than usual, asking for clarity, for the courage to act if something here was truly wrong. By the 3rd evening he had resolved to write to the bishop, but the letter was never sent. The following morning the village woke to the news that Father Lucien had not returned to his parish. His sleigh was found, abandoned on the frozen road near the river. One of the horses still harnessed, its flank lathered with sweat despite the cold. The other horse was missing. Downstream, tangled in a cluster of reeds, a scrap of black cassock cloth fluttered in the current. No body was recovered. At the orphanage, Sister Genevieve led the morning prayers with her usual calm. In her ledger, beneath the entry for Emilian's number, she added a new line in small, precise handwriting. There was no number beside it, no name, only a date, and a short piece of coarse dark hair glued neatly to the page. For weeks after the priest's disappearance, the air in the orphanage seemed heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed his final unanswered questions. Emilian kept his head down, his eyes lowered, but his mind was restless. The Red Wing had always been forbidden, yet now the urge to see inside had grown into something he could not quiet. The door was always locked, the key a constant weight on Sister Genevieve's chest, and the few times she entered or left, she did so with the swiftness of someone moving between 2 worlds. Emilian noticed she would often emerge carrying nothing but return with the faint smell of scorched metal clinging to her habit. It was the smell that finally drew him to try. One late afternoon, when the snow outside was falling in soft sheets and the rest of the children were corralled into the study hall, Sister Genevieve left her quarters and descended toward the laundry, leaving her keys hanging from the hook inside her office. An oversight she had never made before. Emilian's breath caught in his throat as he slipped inside. The keys were cold in his hand, their weight strange and dangerous. He walked quickly down the narrow corridor to the Red Wing, every step a drumbeat in his ears. The lock turned with a heavy click and the door swung inward. Heat spilled into the hallway, followed by a low hum that seemed to vibrate in his bones. The room was small, its walls lined with shelves, but his eyes were drawn immediately to the copper machine in the center. It was larger than he had imagined, its curves too smooth, its surface polished to an unnatural gleam. Glass flasks and tubes snaked around it, catching the light in sharp glints. The smell of burnt sugar and something faintly bitter hung in the air. On the shelves were rows of small wooden coffins stacked neatly like crates. Each one was no larger than a bread box, the wood pale and unvarnished. Emilian's fingers shook as he reached for the nearest, lifting the lid just enough to see what lay inside, a small bundle of muslin cloth tied tightly with white ribbon and beneath it hair. Not loose strands, but entire locks, thick and curling, each bound as if ready to be displayed. Some were pale blonde, others deep black, each labeled with a date written in Sister Genevieve's meticulous script. There were dozens of these coffins, each with its own label. Beside the coffin stood glass jars filled with the same kind of hair he had seen in her quarters. But here they were unsealed, the curls loose and spilling slightly over the rims. A long table held several open ledgers, their pages crowded with notes. Emilian could not read all the words, but he recognized the columns. Dates, measurements, and the word yield written over and over. At the far end of the table was something else, a row of small vials, each containing a colorless liquid. The glass seemed to catch the heat from the copper machine, making the liquid shimmer faintly. Next to the vials was a child's toy, a wooden spinning top, worn smooth from use. He knew it belonged to Julian, a boy who had vanished from the dormitory weeks before. A sudden hiss from the machine made Emilian start. Steam curled upward from a vent and the hum grew louder. He stepped back, his heel knocking into a coffin on the floor, sending it sliding a few inches. The sound was louder than he expected, and panic gripped him. He replaced the lid, slipped back to the door, and pulled it shut, turning the key slowly to keep it from clicking too loud. He returned the keys to Sister Genevieve's office just as the study hall door opened and the children filed out. She appeared moments later, her eyes sweeping the hallway. Emilian kept his gaze on the floor, but he felt her stare linger on him for a fraction too long. That night, he could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the coffins, the labeled hair, the vials shimmering in the heat. He thought of Julian's spinning top, and of how quietly the boy had been erased from the world. In her private ledger, a new entry appeared under Emilian's number. Access risk. Observation required. The winter finally broke, but the thaw brought no relief. By spring of 1899, something in the rhythm of the orphanage shifted. For years, the village had marked the passing of its smallest souls with quiet burials in the churchyard. The priest's Latin murmurs carried on the wind, the soft thud of earth over the coffin. But that year no graves were dug. Not one child was lowered into the frozen soil, not from the village and certainly not from the hill. To outsiders, this seemed a blessing. People spoke of Sister Genevieve's care as miraculous, her discipline and hygiene so effective that she had driven death from her doors. Even the bishop sent a letter of praise. Inside the orphanage, the truth was far stranger. The infirmary door still opened at night, but now those taken there did not vanish entirely. They returned days or weeks later, walking slowly, their skin pale as milk, their eyes glazed like glass left in winter frost. They ate without protest, spoke little, and moved through their chores with a mechanical obedience that unsettled even the other children. Emilian noticed their hair was always cropped shorter than before, their scalps smooth and pink. They seemed lighter somehow, not in body, but in the way they carried themselves, as if their weight in the world had been lessened. Sister Genevieve was more active than ever. The red wing hummed almost nightly, the copper machine's faint hiss seeping into the stone corridors. The smell of burnt sugar and boiled herbs hung in the air long after she had left, clinging to the children's bedding, to their clothes, even to their skin. She had begun giving milk to certain children twice a day instead of once, pouring it herself from a small pitcher she carried from the locked room. She would stand over them until they drank every drop, her expression unreadable. The changes in those children were undeniable. Their faces lost whatever small flicker of defiance had once lingered there. They stopped fidgeting, stopped glancing toward the windows or whispering to each other when her back was turned. Their voices, when they spoke at all, were flat, without the rise and fall of ordinary speech. Some forgot their numbers during roll call, standing silently until she told them where to go. She recorded these changes in her ledger as stabilizations, marking the dates with neat strokes of her pen. To her, these were victories. Proof that her science of purity had moved beyond the point of death. She no longer needed the grave to finish her work. The village noticed the children looked healthier, even if they were quieter. A few families came to the gate to inquire about adoptions, but Sister Genevieve politely declined, explaining that it was better for the orphans to remain together until they reached a certain stage of readiness. No one questioned what that meant. They only saw that the funeral bells had been silent for months and took it as a sign of God's favor. Emilian could not share their relief. He had begun to watch the returned children closely, looking for signs that they were still themselves. Sometimes, when they thought no one was watching, he would see a tremor pass through their hands or a flicker of confusion in their eyes, as if some part of them was still aware of what had been taken. Once, late at night, he heard one of them whisper a name, not their own, but one that had belonged to a boy buried the winter before. The voice was flat, almost detached, but the sound froze Emilian where he lay. He wondered what would happen if the process failed, if a child resisted whatever she was doing in that locked room. He did not have to wait long for an answer. One evening during the final prayer before bed, a boy in the front row began to tremble. His head jerked in short, sharp movements, his eyes rolling back. Sister Genevieve was at his side instantly, her hand pressing firmly against the back of his neck, her lips moving in that same low, rhythmic chant Emilian had once heard through the red wing door. The trembling stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and the boy's head sagged forward. Two older children lifted him under her direction and carried him away. He did not return. After that, the milk ritual became stricter. Those chosen to drink from her pitcher did so under her unblinking gaze, her fingers lightly resting on the rim as if to sense their hesitation. Emilian, who had not yet been chosen for the second daily dose, began to fear the day she might decide he was ready. The absence of burials became its own kind of silence in the village. People stopped asking after the children. The bells did not toll. The churchyard grass grew unbroken, the graves from previous winters fading into the overgrowth. Life seemed on the surface better, but Emelian could feel the change in the air, a stillness that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with something being bound, contained, and waiting. In her ledger, beneath the column for the year's work, Sister Genevieve added a single note in her fine, precise script: Stage 2 successful. The living can be made to yield. It began with the smell of smoke, faint at first, threading through the corridors in the dead of night. Emelian had been awake, lying rigid in his bed when he caught it. Not the clean tang of the coal stove, but the bitter scent of fabric smoldering. Moments later, the orphanage bell clanged, its sharp, uneven toll echoing against the stone. Footsteps pounded in the hallway, shouts rose from the older children, and somewhere far below, glass shattered. The heat followed quickly, a dry wave that seemed to suck the air from the dormitory. The laundry room was at the base of the south wing, directly beneath the red wing, and it was there the fire had taken hold. By the time Emelian reached the stairs, smoke was already curling up from the floorboards. The air burned his throat as he coughed, covering his mouth with his sleeve. Through the haze, he saw Sister Genevieve moving with frightening calm, her voice carrying over the chaos. She directed the older boys to form a chain for buckets of water, ordered the younger ones into the courtyard, and locked eyes with Emelian only once, a brief, sharp glance that told him to keep moving. In the courtyard, the cold bit hard against the skin, but the heat from the burning wing washed over them in waves. Sparks leapt into the night, and the flames climbed the walls with unnatural speed, as if drawn toward the locked rooms above. The copper machine's hum was gone now, replaced by the groan of timber and the hiss of steam bursting from the pipes. Through the windows of the red wing, light flickered wildly, and for a moment Emelian thought he saw the silhouette of Sister Genevieve moving inside, her hands reaching for something on the shelves. Then the roof over that section collapsed with a thunderous crack, sending a plume of smoke and glowing embers into the sky. The older boys pulled her away from the door, but she did not resist. She simply stood there, her face illuminated by the fire's glow, watching the flames consume the building as if she were witnessing the completion of a long-awaited task. The smoke thickened, choking the courtyard. Some of the younger children began to panic, trying to push toward the gates, but they were locked. The buckets passed more slowly now, water sloshing over frozen hands, evaporating almost instantly on the glowing stones. Inside, the fire roared as it reached the shelves. Emelian heard a sound that cut through the crackling, the shattering of dozens of glass jars. The air filled with an acrid, sweet scent, sharp enough to make his eyes water. It was the smell of burnt hair. When the flames finally reached the small coffin stored along the back wall, there was a muffled series of pops, followed by a rush of darker smoke that poured from the windows. Some children sobbed openly now, but Sister Genevieve remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had not once tried to lead them toward the gates. By dawn, the south wing was a gutted shell, its stone walls blackened, The roof gone. 27 children were unaccounted for. The survivors huddled together in the frost, their faces gray with soot, their hair matted with ash. Emilian was among those pulled from the edge of the collapsed laundry room, his hands blistered from hauling water. He clutched something to his chest so tightly that no one could pry it from him. A glass jar, its surface scorched, containing a single curl of brown hair tied with white ribbon. The village gathered at the base of the hill, drawn by the smoke and the sight of the ruined wing. Some offered blankets, others bread or broth, but their eyes flickered with unease. The absence of bodies among the debris was noted in hushed tones. Sister Genevieve accepted their condolences with measured grace, thanking them for their prayers and assuring them that God's will had been done. In the days that followed, no funerals were held. The charred remains of the Red Wing were cleared by hired men from outside the village, who were instructed not to speak of what they found. Emilian overheard one whisper that the coffins had been empty save for bundles of cloth and hair. Another swore he had seen small glass vials fused together by the heat, their contents boiled away. Sister Genevieve moved the surviving children into the remaining wings and resumed her routines as if nothing had changed. The laundry was relocated, the lessons continued, and the smell of soap once again filled the halls. But at night, Emilian noticed her standing in the courtyard, looking toward the charred foundation of the Red Wing. She never wept, never crossed herself. It was as though she had buried something in those flames, not lost it. In her ledger, under the date of the fire, she wrote a single line in red ink. All yields released. Cycle complete. The investigators arrived 3 days after the fire, sent from the prefecture in Saint-Denis. They came in dark wool coats, their boots leaving crisp prints in the frost, their eyes scanning the hill with the wary precision of men expecting to find trouble. Sister Genevieve greeted them in the courtyard, her composure unshaken, the faint smell of soap drifting from her sleeves. She answered their questions in a voice that carried neither guilt nor defensiveness, speaking of the fire as if it were an act of nature, an unavoidable tragedy. She said the children lost had been sleeping in the south wing, trapped before they could be woken, the flames too fast for rescue. But as the men walked through the ruins, their expressions changed. The south wing was nothing but blackened stone and twisted metal. Yet amid the debris, they found patterns that did not fit the story. In what had been the far corner, shielded by a partial wall collapse, was a table of warped metal with glass melted into its surface. The remains of some kind of apparatus far larger than any laundry equipment. Nearby, buried under a charred beam, they discovered a row of small wooden boxes, their lids blackened but intact. Inside each was not a body or even bone fragments, but a neat bundle of cloth tied with white ribbon, each holding a curl of hair. By the second day of searching, the men had gathered dozens of such bundles. They were brought into what remained of the main hall and laid out in rows on a long table. The sight was grotesque in its precision, each curl distinct in color and texture, each ribbon tied in the same exact knot, each labeled with a date written in a fine, slanted hand. None of the dates matched the fire. Some went back years. It was on the third morning that one of the men entered Sister Genevieve's quarters and emerged, holding a book bound in something pale and coarse. At first glance it appeared to be leather, but under the light the fine strands woven into its surface revealed themselves as human hair. Inside, the pages were filled with her meticulous handwriting. Each entry bore a date, a number, and a short description written in a code that the investigators could not immediately decipher. Affixed to every page was a curl of hair, glued firmly beneath the date, the color matching the entry. Some were noted as yield high, others deficient, and in rare cases exceptional clarity. When they confronted her with the ledger, she did not deny it was hers. She explained calmly that it was a record of the children she had cared for, that each lock of hair was a keepsake, preserved in case the child was ever adopted and wished to have something of their earliest years. Her tone was so steady, her eyes so unwavering, that one of the younger men almost believed her. But the older among them knew there was something else here, something too deliberate to be innocent. Their search of the remaining wings revealed more jars hidden in locked cupboards, each filled with curls sorted by shade and length. In the cellar beneath the chapel, they found shelves of glass vials, some fused by heat, others intact. Many were empty, but a few still held a faint residue of colorless liquid. When asked what it was, she replied simply, "Purity." The villagers, hearing of these discoveries, began to gather at the gates. Whispers ran through the crowd of the hair parcels that had appeared on doorsteps after a child's death, of the strange changes in those who returned from the infirmary, of the absence of burials over the past year. Some spoke in anger, others in fear, but none dared confront her directly. The investigators took the ledger, the jars, and several of the vials back to Saint-Denis for examination. Sister Geneviève was not arrested. The church insisted on conducting its own inquiry, and for weeks afterward she continued to run the orphanage as if nothing had changed. The gaps in the dormitories filled by new arrivals from other parishes. Emilian watched her closely, wondering if the loss of the red wing had truly ended her work or if she had simply moved it somewhere no one had yet found. One evening, as the sun set behind the blackened ruin of the south wing, Emilian saw her standing in the courtyard with the empty jar he had carried from the fire. She turned it slowly in her hands, her thumb tracing the scorched ribbon inside. Then she looked up at the sky, as if gauging the light, and carried it back inside without a word. In the margins of the final page in her ledger, written in a faint, almost invisible script, was a single line. "The vessel is nothing without the essence, and the essence always finds a way." By the winter of 1937, the orphanage on the hill no longer existed. The fire had taken one wing, but time and scandal had eroded the rest. The building was torn down in 1912, its stone carried away for other uses, its iron gates sold for scrap. The ground where it once stood was left bare, a patch of uneven earth dotted with frost-bitten grass. Most of the villagers preferred it that way, an absence where something dangerous had once been. Only Emilian, now an old man, still walked the hill. It was on one such cold afternoon that he boarded a train to Saint-Denis. His hands, gnarled and thin, clutched a small wooden box. Inside was the scorched glass jar he had carried from the fire all those years ago, its ribbon brittle with age, the curl of brown hair still intact. He had kept it hidden for decades, telling no one, not even his wife. But in recent months, dreams had returned to him. Dreams of dripping water, of the copper machine's hiss, of children's eyes gone flat and distant. The memories no longer blurred with time. They sharpened, and with them came the guilt he had carried since boyhood. At the prefecture, he asked to speak to the police. The officers who received him saw nothing more than an elderly man in a threadbare coat, until he set the box on the desk and opened it. He told them he had been one of the orphans under Sister Genevieve, that he had seen what no one else had dared to see, and that he had helped her in ways he could no longer bear to remember. The confession began haltingly, but soon the words spilled out. He told them of the nightly inspections of the jars of hair, of the copper contraption in the locked room. He admitted he had once carried bundles from the Red Wing to the laundry, not knowing until later that each contained hair taken from the dead or the living, purified to her liking. He spoke of the milk she gave to certain children, laced with the colorless liquid she called essence. And then he told them the part he had never said aloud, that on at least 3 occasions she had instructed him to watch over the returned children in the dormitory and report to her when their eyes stayed fixed for more than an hour. He had done it without question, eager for her approval, believing her when she said he was helping make them ready for heaven. The officers listened in silence, though one could not hide the tightening of his jaw. Emilian insisted he had not understood what he was part of until it was too late, but he admitted he had known enough to be afraid. "She told me fear was the impurity leaving," he said. "She told me mine would leave too if I let her work finish." His account was cross-checked against what little remained of the original investigation. The ledger, now kept in the archives of the diocese, the photographs of the jars and bundles recovered from the fire, the church's own sealed report which had never been released to the public. As he spoke, details matched with eerie precision. The measurements in the ledger, the dates on the ribbons, even the arrangement of the coffins in the Red Wing. The most damning revelation came when Emilian mentioned the church cellar. He explained that after the fire, Sister Genevieve had taken him there under the pretense of retrieving blankets for the surviving children. In a hidden alcove behind a panel of rotting wood, he saw shelves upon shelves of jars identical to those in her quarters, each sealed and labeled. There were hundreds. She told him they were all from other houses, gifts from those who understood her work. He never saw them again, but he was certain they had not been destroyed with the orphanage. His testimony prompted a quiet search. Weeks later, inspectors found a sealed crypt beneath a decommissioned convent outside Saint-Denis. Inside were crates of jars, some empty, some still holding curls of hair, others with the faint residue of liquid clinging to the glass. The church claimed no knowledge of their origin, though the labeling matched Sister Genevieve's hand. When asked why he had waited nearly 40 years to speak, Emilian's answer was simple. "Because I was part of it," he said, his voice shaking. "Because I thought if I stayed quiet, it would stay dead. But it doesn't die. It waits." The police wrote up his statement, but no charges were brought. Not against Emilian, and certainly not against the dead. None. The case was filed away, its evidence boxed and stored. Yet his confession was enough to stir unease. A few local newspapers printed brief stories calling it a ghastly chapter of the past. The public reaction was short-lived. But in certain archives, the name Saint Michel's Orphanage began to appear again, flagged in red ink. When Emilian left the prefecture that evening, the jar was no longer in his possession. It would be logged, examined, and placed with the others. Walking through the cold streets of Saint-Denis, he felt lighter for having spoken, but the relief was tainted with the knowledge that no one could undo what had been done. In the official report, his statement closed with a line he insisted they write exactly as he said it. "She told me the essence always finds a way, and now I believe her." The confession in Saint-Denis did not ignite the outrage Emilian might have imagined. Outside of a few short articles buried in regional newspapers, the story of Sister Geneviève remained largely confined to whispers and dusty archives. The church's influence ensured that the case was treated as a historical oddity rather than a crime with enduring consequences. Officially, the events were recorded as a misguided application of care methods in a period of limited medical understanding. Unofficially, those who had grown up in the shadow of Saint Michel's orphanage still lowered their voices when her name was spoken. In St. Clair, the hill where the orphanage had stood remained empty, the earth uneven, wild grass and nettles hiding the last traces of stone foundation. Children dared each other to climb it at night, but few stayed long. Locals said the air there was colder than the rest of the village, that birds avoided nesting on the slope, and that in winter the snow melted unevenly as though something beneath still radiated a slow, unnatural heat. No one put up a memorial. There were no plaques, no prayers read at Mass. The loss was left unmarked, as if the silence could erase it. Yet some traces slipped through the cracks of suppression. In 1941, a health inspector in Lyon discovered jars of hair in the basement of a defunct orphanage run by the same religious order. The labels matched Sister Geneviève's handwriting exactly. In 1950, a retired police clerk in Saint-Denis quietly admitted to a journalist that the essence vials from the convent crypt had never been destroyed. They had been transferred to a private church repository for study. Each time such details surfaced, they were dismissed as rumors or the fantasies of those seeking attention. For Emilian, who lived out his final years in a small rented room in the outskirts of Saint-Denis, the silence was a second kind of punishment. He had hoped that by speaking the record would be set straight, that people would understand the scale of what had been done. Instead, he watched the world turn away from it, the same way it had in the Autumn winter of 1899 when the burials stopped. In the years after his confession, he kept a small notebook filled with names, not of the children whose names he could barely remember anymore, but of the villages, towns, and parishes where Sister Geneviève's influence had reached. He marked each with a question mark, uncertain if what happened on the hill had been repeated there. By the mid-20th century, France's orphanage system had changed. Secular oversight increased, and religious orders were forced to submit to state inspections. Official reports credited these reforms to modernization and advances in child welfare, but in the margins of Emilian's own notebook he wrote, "They learn to hide in plain sight." He feared that while the methods had changed, the logic behind them, the belief that a person could decide what was pure and strip away everything else, had not died with Sister Geneviève. St. Clair itself shrank as young people left for the cities. The few elders who remembered the orphanage kept their memories close, not out of reverence, but because speaking of it brought only discomfort and suspicion. One of the last to speak openly was Maëlle, the former laundress who had once recognized the ribbon on the hair parcels. Before her death in 1964, she told a visiting niece that she had seen Sister Geneviève carry sealed crates to the church cellar at night, always after a death, always alone. The niece tried to tell the story decades later, but it was met with the same polite disinterest as Emilien's confession. When Emilien died in 1969, his belongings were sorted by a charity worker. Among them was his notebook and a single-folded newspaper clipping, a short obituary for Sister Geneviève, dated 1904, noting her untiring devotion to the care of God's children, and the tragedy of the fire that had claimed so many lives. The charity worker, not understanding its significance, discarded it. The notebook, however, was kept and eventually donated to a small regional museum, where it sits in a drawer labeled Miscellaneous Village Records. Over time, the orphanage passed into the realm of local folklore. The hill became a cautionary tale told to children who misbehaved. Keep quiet, or the soap nun will come for you in the night. Tourists passing through St. Clair sometimes heard the story in cafes, its edges dulled, its horrors replaced by vague hints of strange medicine and old religious practices. In this softened form, the truth became survivable, but also forgettable. The true legacy of Sister Geneviève was not in the hair she kept, the vials she distilled, or the children she remade. It was in the silence she left behind, a silence that settled over St. Clair, over the church archives, over every place her methods had touched. It was the kind of silence that does not fade but adapts, finding new ways to make itself comfortable in the spaces people prefer not to look at. Emilien had once feared she was right when she told him the essence always finds a way. By the end, he realized she had not been speaking of a substance at all. She had been speaking of the idea. Evil rarely announces itself with noise. It does not arrive in the shriek of sirens or the clash of armies. It slips in quietly, wrapped in the language of care, hidden behind faces people trust. That was the lesson of the hill at St. Clair. Not that a single woman could do monstrous things, but that an entire community could watch her do them and call it devotion. The orphanage was not a fortress. It had doors, windows, corridors anyone might have walked. Yet for years no one did. The gates stayed shut because no one wanted to see what might be inside. In the decades since, the systems that allowed Sister Geneviève to work in secret have been dismantled, replaced with laws, inspections, and records that cannot be altered by a single hand. Yet those measures depend on people, on their willingness to question, to look closely, to act when something feels wrong. And people, history shows, are often eager to believe the version of events that hurts the least. The silence that protected the orphanage was not born of ignorance alone. It was comfort, a shield against the weight of knowing. Even now, the hill remains empty, though the land has been sold 3 times. Each buyer backed away after visiting, citing structural issues or unsuitable soil. The truth is harder to name. Those who stand there speak of feeling watched, of hearing the faint drip of water where there is no source, of catching a whiff of soap carried on a wind that should smell only of grass and earth. The locals dismiss it as an old superstition, but their children still avoid the slope after dark. The church's sealed records on the orphanage are still locked away, though researchers have petitioned for their release. Each time the answer is the same. It would serve no purpose to reopen wounds so long closed. In public statements, the story of Saint Michel's is reduced to a tragedy caused by archaic methods and the limited understanding of the time. In private, some archivists admit there are more ledgers, more jars, more records of similar purity work carried out in other places under other names. The extent of it may never be known. For those who have studied the case, the question is not whether such a thing could happen again, but how it would look if it did. It would not be an orphanage on a hill. It would not be a nun with jars in her quarters. It would be something that fits the present. A program, an institution, a practice wrapped in scientific or moral language that makes it seem necessary. The tools would change, but the logic would not. Someone would still decide who is worth saving, who must be altered, and who can be erased quietly. The last surviving photograph of Sister Genevieve shows her standing in the courtyard surrounded by children. The image is blurred at the edges, but her face is sharp, her expression calm. She does not touch the children, though they stand close. In her hand, partly hidden by her sleeve, is a small ribbon, white, frayed at the edge. For those who know the history, it is the most telling detail in the image. For everyone else, it is invisible. In 1974, a memorial stone was quietly placed in the churchyard of St. Clair. It bears no names, only the words, "For the lost children of the hill." No one has claimed responsibility for commissioning it. Some say it was the work of a parish priest burdened by what the archives hold. Others think it was the act of a villager who could no longer stand the absence of any marker at all. The stone is small, easily overlooked among the older graves. In winter, it disappears entirely under the snow. The lesson the hill leaves is as much about the living as it is about the dead. The children who passed through Saint Michel's were not just victims of one woman's cruelty. They were victims of a system that rewarded her for appearing tireless, spotless, and unquestionable. They were victims of neighbors who chose not to look, of priests who chose not to speak, of a society that found it easier to praise her than to confront her. That kind of silence does not belong to one century. It can exist anywhere in any time if people let it. As the sun sets on the hill, the air turns sharp, the light fading from the grass. Those who linger say that in the last moments before dark, the wind carries a sound like distant water, slow and deliberate as if counted. Whether it is memory or something else, no one can say. What is certain is that the ground remembers, even if the world does not. So the question remains, could it happen again? The answer lies not in the past, but in whether people are willing to see what is in front of them, and to act before the jars fill once more. What do you think? Could this happen again?